What's up, designers? Let's get back into Illustrator and kind of expand on our basic pen tool, anchor point drop, and Bezier curves. Let's actually talk about how we might be able to make use of some of these shape building tools to speed up and simplify and maybe even clean up some of your tracings. I've got some examples here that I'll use, but let me just kind of quickly run through the tools that I'm going to cover in this tutorial. The shape tools like your ellipse tool or the rectangle tool. How to make use of compound paths, how to use the Pathfinder palette, the shape builder tool, the align palette, and how to make use of the rotate tool during the design process. Let's just jump right in because I think it probably is just going to make a whole lot more sense once I demonstrate these things. If you happen to have some designs that it works on, awesome, follow along. If you just want to kind of riff on what I'm doing here in my designs just to practice them, I think that's a really great idea too, even if none of your designs have the exact exact need for it at this moment. These are just great tools to have at your fingertips. So for example, the shape tools. If in your designs you made use of some basic shapes, like let's just say a circle tool, wouldn't it be really handy if you had the ability to just, instead of having to trace out your circle using the pen tool, which, is a good skill to have, but just to lay in a perfect circle in one pull, well, all of your shape building tools are sort of hiding under most likely your rectangle tool. Rectangle tool is M, ellipse tool is L, but another really good one to know is the polygon tool. Now the polygon tool right out of the gates is just going to produce for you, whatever it's set to. But if you want to control how many sides it has, say for example making an equilateral triangle, one click and you can manipulate the sides, and you can also manipulate the radius of those sides. Okay, so if you wanted to kind of work with triangular shapes or any complex polygon, the shape tool will sort of quickly generate those. Now in this case, I've got a circle that I'm going to work with, and my circle is in the form of a ring. So I've got a few ways that I could deal with this. My ring is perfectly aligned, right? I cut it on a circle cutter in the classroom, so I could just draw a second circle inside of there and do my best to line them up perfectly. That could totally work. There is a palette that's going to help us out with that sort of alignment. If I select both of these circles at the same time and I open up my align palette, if you don't have your align palette open, go to Window on the top of the screen, align, that's Shift F7 for those of you guys who like those keyboard shortcuts. And when I open up my align palette, I have all of these little icons, and I'll pay really close attention to what they look like. I'm going to do a horizontal align center and then a vertical align center. That should snap these two rings into perfect alignment. Now, just in case, I bump them and move them out of whack, I might select them both and do a Command G. That would be the same thing as right-clicking and grouping those two shapes. Now, they're sort of connected. But if I try to fill these shapes, let's just say I fill them black, Illustrator still doesn't really think of them as a ring. It just thinks of them as two separate circles, one concentrically inside of the other. If I want those two circles to behave like a ring, I need to use another keyboard shortcut, Command 8. That's the keyboard shortcut for Object, Compound Path, Make. That essentially tells Illustrator that I want this ring to behave like a ring. Or if I had, any kind of complex shapes, if I had these two shapes, a circle inside of a square, Command 8, this is now going to behave like a window inside of that shape. Now the really cool thing about this is that if I double click into that shape, I can have control over what's going on with that internal shape. It stays live. Now a really obvious example of this would be in text. Like let's just say, for example, I use my initials and expand them so that they are shapes. So many different letters make use of this kind of shape. So those of you guys who are into typography, you really like this idea of being able to manipulate text. These are just compound paths, so if you wanted to be able to play with those, change them around, get access to those inside shapes, or just delete them, release the compound path. Down here though, I'm still kind of working on these two rings. I'll demonstrate one other technique for making that ring happen. I'm going to go to L, make sure I draw out my circle, and as I'm drawing that circle, I want it to be perfect, right? So instead of having to kind of guesswork that thing into position using the ellipse tool, I'll hold Shift. Shift automatically snaps that circle into a perfect disc, a perfect circle. And if I simultaneously hold spacebar, I can move it around and put it into a specific position. Very handy for trying to match shapes to an existing design like what we're working with. I'm going to go stroke only here. Now if I, instead of drawing a second circle, if I want to just sort of make a concentric circle just inside, I'll go to Object, Path, offset path. In this way, I can use sort of these built-in adjustments that the computer has to sort of make a very precise inset or outset circle. In this case, if I really wanted to have a precise, 0.375 inch ring, I could just make it that way. I'll probably just kind of eyeball this one. I'm using a 2-finger scroll on the keypad, or the scroll on a mouse would do this in here. And as long as my preview is turned on, that works pretty well. Now, these 2 rings are still being treated like solid circles, so it doesn't take away that compound path step. Now, the other thing that's going on in this design are these overlapping rectangles that have this K shape. If I switch to my keyboard shortcut M, the rectangle tool, I could hover over the corner of this rectangle, and if I'm using my move tool, I get the ability to rotate them, and that works pretty well. It pivots them right on this central spot here in the middle. There's a bit of trial and error, but if I trial and error that enough, I probably could get that to fit. But what if I made my rectangle, and instead of trying to trial and error that, I use the move tool to kind of get it close. I put one of the corners about where it needed to be. I'll put a corner down here, focusing on this pivot point, and I use R, the keyboard shortcut R, set the rotate tool, and just pivot that thing into position. That is a really handy way to make that rectangle fit right where it needs to be. R is the keyboard shortcut for the rotate tool hiding over here in your toolbar. I could just make copies of this rectangle now, and as long as I'm pivoting along a familiar point, or a point that makes sense to me, keyboard shortcut R, the first click is the pivot point, the successive click is the rotate point. This always feels to me like the way maybe a mechanical engineer might do his design, something that's going to just kind of flow really intuitively with the way mechanical objects swing and move around. Didn't quite get that one, so I'm just going to move it. I'll use the arrow keys on my keyboard maybe sometimes to tap these into position. Now I've got these overlapping shapes. I would like them to join up with this outer circle or join up with themselves. Let's treat those one at a time. As long as I have overlapping shapes, I can select all 3 of them, and I could either click and drag over the shapes to do that, or I could click one at a time by selecting one, holding Shift, selecting the next 2, and use the Pathfinder palette. If you don't have the Pathfinder palette open, go to Window, Pathfinder, that's Shift Command F9, and this sort of mode of the shape of the Pathfinder tool, Unite, is a really handy one. If I have overlapping shapes and click Unite, I don't have to pen tool out any of those tracings. It automatically snaps those into one shape, and they're already combined with really minimal anchor point work. That is an incredibly handy tool to have. Now, if I do the same thing up here, I'm going to grab my keyboard shortcut A, selection tool, and just sort of bring these points down inside the outer edge of the circle. I should be able to Pathfinder those lines in as well. This one I need to kind of tip a little bit sideways. Select both the ring and that K shape, Pathfinder, Unite, and now my design is complete. Now that made use of a couple handy tools, but boy, that really sped up the tracing of that project. Let me go one shape over to the left here to show you another alternative to the Pathfinder that might even speed it up a little bit more. I'll go through some of these same steps. I'm going to make a ring inside of a ring. Then I'll grab both of those and align them vertically and align them horizontally. And since these outer shapes here are also sort of truncated rings, I'll use a disc for those as well. This way, I make sure that I get nice, clean lines without any kind of hiccups. They are perfectly circular, and it really speeds up this process. I could probably pen tool this one out, but boy, that's going to take me a while. Now, I've got all these same overlaps, but if I jump right to the Pathfinder tool, this may get a little bit messy. I may end up losing a lot of the shapes and end up with this kind of Mickey Mouse looking thing. Instead, I'll keep all of my shapes selected, and I'll come back over to my toolbar and grab the Shape Builder tool, Shift M. With with these shapes selected, you see how it sort of gives me this mesh color here. If I drag one shape into the next, it automatically merges those shapes. Now, as long as I'm working with overlapping shapes, this should work just fine. And this gives me a much more precise kind of way to go about combining shapes. And the other really cool thing is that because of those shapes have been combined and grouped, Illustrator has already sort of cut out these extra shapes that I don't need. Man, that really sped it up, and it gave me a very precise way to do these cuts. All I would need to do then is cut this circle off at the edges, and I've got that design completed. Now this design, I'll make use of the Align palette in a different way, and I'll make use of the ability to sort of make fast copies to quickly render a design that's similar to this. I'm not going to go for an exact copy because it has a lot of sort of funky inconsistencies. This is all hand-cut paper, but I'll kind of quickly pen tool trace out each one of these designs. And I'll copy this, just this kind of motif over to the left. I'll switch it to fill, and now I'm going to just make a copy here. I'll select both of those again, make a copy, select all four of those and make a copy, so I've been able to quickly generate that design. I'll grab every one of these designs, go to my Align palette, and this time I'm going to vertically distribute center, which essentially puts more or less the same amount of space in between each one of these tools. That sort of spacing is handy. If I need to make sure that my edges are aligning, I can also snap these to alignment. And I didn't want to align a whole shape, just these edges, and so I used the keyboard shortcut A to snap just these points into alignment. Now, since I was in the middle of sort of working with a motif here, I might as well grab this entire design and copy it over, and copy it over again. And in this way, I'm quickly able to generate a repeating pattern out of a design that was really just two pieces. While we were doing the cut paper part of this design experiment, I used a white ring on white paper to help align each one of these squares. If I just grab one of these squares, I kind of quickly pen tool trace this thing out. Could have used the rectangle tool, I suppose, but I'll just kind of pen tool that out. Is there a way that I can sort of get Illustrator to generate a ring of these squares and all line up nicely around the edge of the circle, maybe even better than what I did here? Well, go to Effect, Distort and Transform, Transform. Anytime I'm working with an effect in Illustrator, it's really handy to have the preview turned on. Now, some of these effects are pretty memory intensive, so they're going to bog your computer down, but this one isn't too bad. You could work with the sliders, that's not bad. I kind of like to click into this window and do a 2-finger scroll on the keypad. That way I can kind of see a pretty live adjustment. I'm going to do a horizontal shift. I'm going to change its angle just a bit. Oop, I better make my copies first, and then make my copies and bend that angle around. Now this is going to give me a pretty good sense of how many copies I'm going to need to go all the way around, and whether my design will line up nicely or whether it needs some sort of tweaks along the way. That looks pretty good. I'll click OK. Now Illustrator, whenever I kind of work with effects, still thinks of this as a single shape. If I pull this out, see how it just looks like one square, and then I copy out that whole design. If I want access to each and every one of these, I have to go to Object, Expand Appearance. Effects come in as appearances, and once I have that appearance opened up, I can get access to individual squares. Right-click, Ungroup, and now each one of these squares becomes workable again. That's a really handy tool for working with radial symmetries, or mandala-like repeated patterns, and it's just another way to work with the built-in guides that make Illustrator kind of user-friendly and much faster than working in cut paper. Guys, I'm excited to see what you do with these techniques. I'll catch up with you back in the studio.